And now the most important part, which is the skull. And you can see the parts they actually found in brown. The rest in white is plaster, and they're filling in the rest. So the problem is we have 5% evidence and 95% assumption. And even looking at this, to me, this part here indicates this was not a human or humanoid, this was a chimp. So to me, even based on their own evidence, this was not a human, but it was a chimp. Remember, this is evidence A for human evolution. The best evidence they have. And then artist interpretation. I had a whole series of these, which I couldn't get in my PowerPoint yet, but these are same skull, different results of filling in the details. So we had the same skull given to 3 artists. One got this, one got this, and one got this. Notice how different they are. And that's called artistic license. I did a debate at the African American Museum in Detroit, and I debated one of the evolutionists, and we had taken a walk through the museum there, which they had all this stuff in there. And I says, how can they get all this variation based on a plaster skull, basically? He said, well, artistic license. They produce it based on what they think it was. Well, I think it was something different, so therefore what I would produce would be very, very different. And that is a problem. A problem is when people look at this, they see this as this is science. And if I see this, then that's what he must have looked like. This is science. We've seen that word thrown out a lot recently about this is science, you must do this or not do that based on the science. Well, people can base all kinds of things on the science, but that doesn't mean, unfortunately, that it's true. And there is a monkey, and you'll notice he's walking on all fours, and the evidence we have actually fits the monkey quite well, and there we go. That's the evidence, and it fits quite well into the monkey model we just looked at. Okay? And when we look at other fossils, again, Lucy's the best example, we find even less evidence and therefore even more conjecture. And so Lucy, the bones here, probably makes this the actual result of what it looked like. Just another monkey. So what do we have? We have monkeys here, chimps, and then we have modern humans, and we have nothing effectively filling the gaps. So we have a gap between monkeys and us that has not been filled. And some people, when I debate the scientists, some people say, well, it's only been 150 years. Give us more time and we will fill in the missing links. And my response is, wait a minute. You've had 150 years and we don't even have one good missing link. What's the problem? Well, we need more time. But that doesn't answer my concern because more time you can say for anything. Well, we don't have this. Well, we just need more time. Well, that doesn't mean you'll get it. We don't have it now, and more time doesn't necessarily solve the problem. Now we look at x-rays of a human skeleton, in this case a skull, and in chimp skull we can see huge differences between the two. And then when we look at them in drawings face forward, primates, Australopithecus, Homo sapiens. And these are what they've drawn, what they look like. Well, if we look into more detail, and these are drawings, if we look into more detail, we find that there's a few things we especially are insightful. Like, for example, where the spinal column, the vertebra, goes into the skull here on humans, and here on the ape is in a very different place. And a better picture of that is right here. This is where the vertebra, the skull, the spinal cord goes into the head, right here, the occipital region, here, 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 here. And here you can't even see it because it's down below. So because humans walk upright, therefore the design of the skull is very, very different based on the fact that we walk upright. And this is a better example. So you can now see the human where it enters into, this is the occipital area of the brain, where it enters into the skull. Very different place from all of the other primates. Orangutan, the first, male gorilla, female gorilla, and a chimp. And humans, quite in contrast. So when we look at Lucy, what do we find? Well, we find something far closer to this, based on what we have, than this. Brain size is also a major difference. Humans, on the average, have a brain about 1,378 grams. Chimps, on the average, about 400 grams. So we can see, size-wise, there's a major difference. But of course, humans are much larger than chimps, about twice to 3 times the weight. And there we can see human brains up here. And then gorilla is the largest, and our supposed close relative, the chimp, is over here. So we can see there's a huge difference between the brain size. Now that's true. We have some humans that have far smaller brains. We have some chimps that have larger brains. But what we have to look at is the average difference, and it is considerable, as you can see. And this is another chart which shows the same thing. Here are human brains, and here are all the other primates where the brains fall. So we can see there's a great deal of difference. This is with the largest chimp brain, and so this is the gap between humans and chimps. But yet, between chimps and other, like rhesus monkeys, you can see there's not that much difference. So size-wise, and another difference, and there are many differences, is the ear. The ear has to be designed in such a way to where you know you are upright when you stand upright. Okay, that would be a problem for chimps that don't spend much time being upright. They need an inner ear that tells them they are on all fours when they're on all fours. And so this is important in order to balance walking, etc. And so we find differences in the inner ear. There are thousands of differences between us and chimps. Thousands of differences. And another example is just the eyes. Very clear difference between human eyes and I think this is probably gorilla eyes. One major difference is that there are not very many, in fact there are very few primates that you can see the whites of the eyes. Almost all primates, there's one exception I believe, almost all primates do not have whites, and you can see that here, where humans have a fairly large area which is, quote, white. And there you can see the difference in the this area here, the sacrum, and this area here. Enormous difference. Designed to walk on all fours, designed to walk on 2 feet. So that's something they look for when they are digging up fossils. And there's a film on that which I hope to be able to show in a few minutes. And there you can see a few of the parts. And again, what they have is in brown. Human hips have shorter, curved iliac blades so that the gluteus medius can attach to, in a way, for upright walking. Gluteus medius is one of the 3 muscles of the buttocks. Gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and gluteus minimus are the 3. When you teach anatomy like I did, you have to learn all that stuff. So, and there you can see the difference in locomotion between a chimp and a human. And there you can see, even in the bones, differences here, and humans, of course, this design would be very different to accommodate what we use our hands for. The hands, you can see, are very different. The hands, you can see, are very different. And this is reflected, of course, in the bone differences as well. And there's a human foot. And the current theory is that Lucy actually died falling out of a tree, they say, 3.1 million years ago. So Lucy wasn't very good on climbing trees. She fell, and the breakage judging by the breakage, they think that that's how she died. And the bones were scattered, I think, around 50 feet an area. And they think that probably Lucy died and then animal wolves and so on consumed her body and spread the body parts. So that's why the body parts were spread in an area of 50 feet. That's the current theory. A lot of this is conjecture, as you know, and brought out earlier that I used to be an atheist. The doorway for me to Christianity was the science. And I stress this in my presentations. People come to Christ by different means. The salvation message is one way, but there are many of us, I have a book which I'm out, and there's none back there, but for many of us, the doorway to Christ was by his creation. We learn about the Creator through studying the creation. And for me, that was very important, studying the creation, because when you study the creation, as Romans says, you are without excuse. That the creation overwhelmingly says that we were created, and that our body and all bodies of animals were designed. And that's very clear when you teach anatomy, as I did for many years. You can see that the body is very ingeniously designed. It's designed for a purpose. And the body we have is very different from that chimps have. And that's what we try to point out in the book. There's a chapter in the book about genetics, and which I wrote with Professor Tompkins, who is a geneticist. And we basically show that the difference between us and chimps genetically is about 450 million base differences. So there's a chasm genetically between us and chimps. Huge difference. And therefore, for us to have evolved from chimps, you're talking about, 450,000 bases, or 900,000 base pairs differences between the two. So there's a chasm genetically between us and chimps. So the evidence is clearly overwhelming. When they talk about this subject, often people talk about the two-model approach, where I think what we should do is explain to students why evolution is not true, the harm it caused, and what indeed the evidence says. And my focus has been pretty much on the harm that evolution has caused in society. And I've written, I think, like 20 books that deal with the harm. The Holocaust is one example. Many other phrenology is another example. And frontal lobotomies is another example. They came about believing we have a reptile brain, and on top of that's the modern brain, which evolved later. And the reason people behave badly is because the reptile brain shows up and dominates or has too much influence. Therefore, the solution is you've got to separate the two brains. And so they use frontal lobotomies they stick an ice pick in your eye and through the brain, which is, the skull is thin in that area, and they go back and they try to separate that. Well, they did about 8,000 different frontal lobotomies, and by the way, most people did not do better. They weren't quite as violent because they become less effective for everything. They don't respond to good and bad and emotions and so on. And so it, in a sense, worked in one way, but on the other hand, it ruined many, many people's lives based on the evolutionary theory. By the way, frontal lobotomy, the guy who developed that got a Nobel Prize for doing that because they thought that was really important. There's a movie on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's, and that, I think, in the end, don't they lobotomize him?
Yeah, I think so.
But I should, several people said I should watch that because it shows the harm. But I'm working on a book now, and actually that's the chapter I'm just reproofing to make sure it's easy to follow. So frontal lobotomies. Another example of the same thing is they discovered that radiation increases mutations. And so they thought, since we are the result of mutations, we need to speed up mutations, and therefore we will speed up evolution. And there is an article in Scientific America which basically said, scientists find ways of speeding up evolution. How they do that is they take you gals when you're pregnant, they put you in an x-ray machine, they zap the fetus and cause mutations, and you will end up with, the theory says, a more evolved human. Well, you know what you're going to end up with. It's foolish. you're going to end up with probably a distorted fetus. In fact, when you have a dental x-ray, they cover your body with a lead shield. And when you're pregnant, don't they warn you against x-ray radiation and so on? And actually that idea as well got a Nobel Prize for speeding up Darwinism. Believe it or not. Unbelievable. And now we know, of course, the harm that that causes, and this is one of many examples of the harm that evolution has caused. So what should we teach in the schools? We should show the horrendous harm that evolution caused, and we should show it's simply not supported. But of course, the courts will not allow that because they know if you disprove evolution, the only other alternative is God created. And they can't accept that because that's a violation of separation of church and state. So in essence, you can't criticize evolution because that supports the religious worldview, and therefore that's unconstitutional because that is supposedly the establishment of a church. Although facts are not a church. Proving evolution is right or wrong is not a church. And this information here is not a church. So don't tell people you went to church today because this is not a church. It's a lecture. It's a presentation. I guess you can call it a sermon if you want to, but it's a presentation. And so tragically we need to, I think, take over the schools. There's some evidence that's happening now. That boy who wore a dress and raped a young girl who was, 12? That is one example of things happening where people are saying, wait a minute. And the father, I guess, got pretty upset in the school board, and they had to wrestle him down and arrest him, and he got jail time. If I was a father and that happened to my daughter, I'll tell you, there'd be more than yelling. Most of you fathers, I bet, would not suffice yelling. You'd be at the throat of the school board members, right? You would not deal with that because you do not accept people raping your, what was she, 12? 12-year-old, 13-year-old daughter. And so people are finally getting upset more and more with the schools, and hopefully that will bring about change. I'm convinced we need to develop more Christian schools so that you have, at least you have both sides and you're able to understand this information. And during the summer, typically, I spend a lot of time going to different Christian schools. And I'll tell you, since I've spent most of my career teaching in public schools, there is a chasm between Christian schools and public schools. And I think we'd all be far better off if we send our kids to Christian schools. I have atheist friends that send their kids to Christian schools because they get a better education. They tell me. And they tell their kids, now you're an atheist, you don't believe in God, but it's a good school, and better study hard and get good grades so you can go to college and do well. But we don't believe in God, so, just ignore them when they talk about God. But it's a good school. And you'd be amazed. I have a friend who's principal of a Catholic school, and she said, this was many years ago, that there are no small number of atheists that attend Catholic schools because they get a better education. And so that's something that we should, I think about. So with that, we get the government we deserve. And I bet a lot of you are very angry at the government now. It's our fault. Think about it. We need to stand up and look for good people, and we should vote and be involved in our community. And it doesn't take a lot of brains to figure out which congressmen are good people, and there are some on both sides, of course, Democrats and Republicans. But they're there, and we should learn where they stand on these issues and then support them. So anyways.
Let's give a hand of appreciation. Tremendous lecture. I said this morning, and I repeat again, this has been, from the creation standpoint, a Gettysburg Address. It's been splendid, to the point, the heart and soul of the entire issue.